Welcome to BBC Secondary Schools. Tonight's programmes focus on the English curriculum. Priestley Shorts takes a look at one of his best-known plays, An Inspector Calls, and analyses key scenes from the point of view of the designer, the performer and the director. This is followed by Study Island Poetry, in which a selection of well-known Irish poets, including Seamus Heaney, Elaine Gaston and Ailish Martin, read some of their own poetry and talk about the inspiration for their work.
This afternoon, a young woman drank some disinfectant and died. A nice little promising life there, I thought, and a nasty mess somebody's made of it. Who is to blame then?
Every production's made up of lots of different elements, and the job of the director is to try and keep all those elements working together towards the same goal.
As the designer, my job is to create the environment, the world in which the characters live, and to convey the vision of the director to the audience.
In a good theatrical production, we are offered life so contrived that everything, the shape and colour of the room, the choice of furnishings, the way that light falls through the window, each has its own significance.
People get excited by the curtain going up, but it's got rain and fantastic lighting and the most extraordinary music. And the action that's kind of choreographed within it is very clever at leading your eye into the house. You know you want to make it interesting for the people watching, but you can't have wow without why. You know, the wow has to be because of the why.
The first thing I did was to read the script, and to read that thoroughly, and to look at all the aspects of that before going in to meet the director. He then gives me some little germ of an idea that he's thinking about. And in a way, we develop from that spark into a much broader, more established idea from those initial meetings.
You're hoping that all the tools that you've got at your disposal, like costumes, lighting, scenery, are all helping to tell your story.
The house is quite a simple metaphor in a sense. The house it's a protective, secure, false world that the family live in. The inspector comes, the house begins to open up. I think in my production, the family, if you like, live in a doll's house. And the inspector's job is to get them out of the pretend world into a place, a wasteland, a dream landscape where they can find themselves and find each other.
I think you remember Reva Smith now, don't you, Mr. Burling?
For an actor, acting is about action, and so they have to have an activity to tell that. So the activity of coming outside the house, and that being rather difficult, and exploring a different area, and leaving somewhere comfortable and going somewhere uncomfortable, and somewhere that's lit very warmly to somewhere that's lit very coldly, that helps them.
The way that the actors will use a space is obviously very important. And a lot of that will come from the director because he's concerned with the performances, the way that the characters are going to move within the space, how small, how cramped that space might be in order to create a certain atmosphere, or how spacious it might be to create the opposite feel.
Inspector Gould.
Mr. Burling?
Yes? Sit down, Inspector.
Thank you, sir.
There.
Obviously, the actors and the director need to go into rehearsal and know where everything's going to be.
You want to sit there?
Is that right?
I think that's quite nice, because then you've got them in there. This is their usual positions of sitting, and you're not kind of welcomed into the group. Yeah.
So not only am I concerned with the look of the piece, but also how that environment is design determines how the action can take place.
I've been round to the room she had, and she left a
Once I've had the initial briefing with the director, then what I like to do is to kind of really immerse myself in it. I like to watch as many films that are involved with that period of time, if it's a historical piece or that subject matter. Go to libraries, go to museums, look at as many things as possible.
Will you be taking coffee now, Mum? Probably in half an hour.
In the last BBC version, right from the onset, the props and the set show us so much about the family, the world that they live in, and the environment into which the inspector steps. With the huge clock ticking away, which shows the importance of time in this play. My favourite version in terms of the design is the 1954 Alistair Sim version, because the dining room is just stuffed with props, huge great palms, heavy wallpaper, and it really gives it quite an oppressive, almost sort of spooky feel, which I really liked.
Do you think we are? Mr. Burling.
What tends to happen with me is that I'll find one little object or one little piece of wallpaper or a little something which will just sum it all up for me.
The wallpaper in a doll's house is always out of scale. It's never correct to the scale of the room. So I got some sort of fake Victorian wrapping paper and put it through a photocopier and made it go weird. So it was blotchy and green and yellow until I liked it, and then made that the wallpaper. And I was interested in the shape of the table and the shape of the front of the balcony. That was all made me happy to worry about that a lot. I liked the daughter in the white dress. She looks very statuesque and very beautiful, and it's very Edwardian and curvy and long, and the house is very kind of perpendicular. And the lines of what she looks like against the lines of the house give me a lot of pleasure. There are lots of associations that I have, but consciously I thought about The Exorcist because of the famous poster where the priest stands outside the house in the lamplight and looks up at a window, knowing that there's something scary and horrible inside there, and he's got to negotiate it. Also, the Gothic house in the movie Psycho. I wanted to do that as well, to have a 20th century story that had an exciting Gothic house in it. But it was an image from the Second War, where you could go to sleep one night and a bomb could drop and the front of your house could be taken off. And there are extraordinary pictures which are actually strangely beautiful, and you could see right into people's houses, like a doll's house. Your entire life would be exposed to the entire street.
Every single item in a set is there because a decision's been made to put it there. No prop is there by accident.
In the 1954 film, there's a really nice use of a mirror, which of course is a prop. The mirror is a symbol really of self-reflection, because this play is very much about people looking back at their responsibilities and their behaviour and what they've done. So I think really the mirror here is used as a symbol of self-awareness.
In this version of An Inspector Calls, we were playing with time, Edwardian and present day side by side, and in order to make that transition, the props were very important. And that was a challenge for the designer, because she had to come up with props that existed in the Edwardian time and had a modern equivalent.
I've got a big parlour palm in the Edwardian set, which to me just says Edwardian interior. And then I had to find a modern day equivalent to that. And I remember finding this big metal palm light, which not only fitted in terms of size, position of the prop, but also was right for that family.
Priestley was interested in the whole idea of time, and I thought we could use that in this version of An Inspector Calls to try and make it more relevant to a modern audience by doing part of it in present day and part of it in the past, and using the inspector to shift between the past and the present, rather like you'd get in Doctor Who or Back to the Future or something like that.
A man has to make his own way. Has to look after himself and his family, of course, when he has one, and so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. But the way some of these cranks talk, and right now you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. But take my word for it, you youngsters, and I've learned in the Goodhart School of Experience that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own, and...
There's somebody at the front door.
Well, Edna will answer it. Have another port, Gerald, then we'll join the ladies. And that'll stop me giving you good advice.
Yes, you've piled it on a bit tonight, Father.
Special occasion, and feeling contented. For once, I thought I'd give you the benefit of my experience.
Please, sir, an inspector's called.
An inspector? What kind of inspector?
A police inspector. He says his name's Inspector Gould.
Don't know him. Does he want to see me?
Well, yes, sir. He says it's important.
All right, Edna, show him in here. Give us some more light. I'm still on the bench. Maybe something about a warrant.
Sure to be. Unless Eric's been up to something. And that would be awkward, wouldn't it?
Very.
Yeah, what do you mean?
It's only something we were talking about when you were out. Joke, really.
But I don't think it's very funny.
What's the matter with you?
Nothing.
Inspector Gould.
Mr. Burley?
Yes. Sit down, Inspector.
Thank you, sir.
Have a glass of port or a little whiskey.
No, thank you, Mr. Burling. I'm on duty.
You're new, aren't you?
Yes, sir. Only recently transferred.
I thought you must be. I was an alderman for years and Lord Mayor 2 years ago, and I'm still on the bench, so I know the Brumley police officers pretty well, and I thought I'd never seen you before.
Quite so.
Well, what can I do for you? Some trouble with a warrant?
No, Mr. Burling.
Well, what is it then?
I'd like some information, if you don't mind, Mr. Burling. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course.
My God.
Yes, she was in great agony. They did everything they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course.
Yes, it's a horrid business, but I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector.
I've been round to the room she had, and she'd left there a letter and a sort of diary. Like a lot of these young women who get themselves in various kinds of trouble, she'd used more than one name. But her original name, her real name, was Eva Smith.
Eva Smith.
You remember her, Mr. Burling?
No. Oh, I seem to remember hearing that name, Eva Smith, somewhere. But it doesn't convey anything to me, and I don't see where I come into this.
She was employed in your works at one time.
Oh, that's it, is it? Well, we've several hundred young women there, and they keep changing.
This young woman, Eva Smith, was a bit out of the ordinary. I found a photograph of her in her lodgings. Perhaps you'd remember her from that.
Any particular reason why I shouldn't see this girl's photograph, Inspector?
There might be.
And the same applies to me, I suppose.
Yeah.
Can't think what that could be.
Neither can I.
Well, I must say I agree with him, Inspector.
It's the way I like to go to work. One person and one line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise, there's a model.
I see. Sensible, really. You've had enough of that port, Eric.
I think you remember Eva Smith now, don't you, Mr. Burling?
Yes, I do. She was one of my employees, and then I discharged her.
Is that why she committed suicide? When was this, Father?
Just keep quiet, Eric, and don't get excited. The girl left us nearly 2 years ago. Let me see, it must have been in the early autumn of 1910.
Yes, end of September 1910.
That's right.
Look here, sir, wouldn't you rather I was out of this?
Oh, I don't mind you being here, Gerald, and I'm sure you've no objection, have you, Inspector? Perhaps I ought to explain first that this is Mr. Gerald Croft, the son of Sir George Croft. You know, Crofts Limited.
Mr. Gerald Croft, eh?
Yes. Incidentally, we've been modestly celebrating his engagement to my daughter, Sheila.
I see. Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Burley.
I hope so.
Then I'd prefer you to stay.
Oh, all right.
Look, there is nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business. At least, not as far as I'm concerned. It's a perfectly straightforward case, and as it happened more than 18 months ago, nearly 2 years ago, it obviously has nothing whatever to do with the wretched girl's suicide. Eh, Inspector?
No, sir, I can't agree with you there.
Why not?
Because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards. And what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide. A chain of events.
Oh, well, put like that, there's something in what you say. Still, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it?
Very awkward.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know. Mummy sent me in to ask you why you didn't come along to the drawing room.
Oh, we shall be along in a minute. Just finishing.
I'm afraid not.
There's nothing else, you know. I've just told you that.
What's all this about?
I'm a police inspector, Miss Burling. This afternoon, a young woman drank some disinfectant and died after several hours of agony tonight in the infirmary.
Oh, how horrible. Was it an accident?
No, she wanted to end her life. She felt she couldn't go on any longer.
Well, don't tell me that's because I discharged her from my employment nearly 2 years ago.
That might have started it.
Did you, Dad?
Yes, the girl was causing trouble in the works. I was quite justified.
Yes, I think you were. I know we'd have done the same thing. But don't look like that, Sheila.
Well, what happened to her then?
She had what seemed to her a wonderful stroke of luck. She was taken on in a shop, and a good shop too. Millwoods.
Millwoods? We go there. In fact, I was there this afternoon for your benefit.
Then she got herself into trouble there, I suppose.
After about a couple of months, just when she felt she was settling down nicely, they told her she had to go.
Not doing her work properly.
There was nothing wrong with the way she was doing her work. They admitted that.
Well, there must have been something wrong.
All she knew was that a customer complained about her, and so she had to go.
When was this?
At the end of January last year.
What did this girl look like?
If you come over here, I'll show you.
What's the matter with her?
She recognized it from the photograph, didn't she?
Yes.
Why the devil do you want to go upsetting the child like that?
I didn't do it. She's upsetting herself.
But why? Why?
I don't know yet. That's something I've got to find out.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll find out first.
Shall I go to her?
No, leave this to me. I must also have a word with my wife. Tell her what's happening. We were having a nice little family celebration here tonight, and a nasty mess you've made of it now, haven't you?
That's more or less what I was thinking earlier tonight, when I was in the infirmary looking at what was left of Eva Smith. A nice little promising life there, I thought, and a nasty mess somebody's made of it. This afternoon, a young woman drank some disinfectant and died nice little promising life there, I thought. And a nasty mess somebody's made of it. Who is to blame then?
Casting is so crucial that, if you like, it's 80% of the director's job is to cast correctly.
Because one actor will play the same part very differently to another actor, and those differences can be very striking.
And he ought to be dealt with very severely!
Oh, stop!
Quiet, Sheila!
But don't you see?
You're behaving like a hysterical child tonight!
He ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, please stop.
You're behaving like an hysterical child tonight, Sheila.
And he ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, stop!
Be quiet, Sheila.
But don't you see?
Oh, you are behaving like a hysterical child tonight.
When an actor's working with the other actors and the director on the development of a character, you obviously look for changes in that character. How do they start, and what's their journey? Where do they finish up?
Sheila, if you like, has the most extreme arc of any character's development in the play, from rather pampered, rather hysterical young girl to somebody who is, if you like, centred herself, who understands herself.
I think the challenges of playing Sheila are, personally, not to make her too spoilt because she has to change. I mean, she can still keep a little element of that because obviously she's come from that sort of family. And where she changes and why she changes.
When was this?
End of January last year.
What did this girl look like?
If you'll come over here, I'll show you.
Having seen excerpts from the different versions, I found it really fascinating how differently she can be played and how real they can all be.
When was this?
The end of January last year.
What was this girl like?
Well, if you'll come over here, Miss Burling, I'll show you.
I think what was interesting about seeing the 1954 version is the way Sheila is very demure, very of that period. She's very locked under her mother's wing and has a lot of respect for her mother.
There are so many different ways that you can play the same lines that are on the page. I think the main decision you have to make early on is what's the central view of this character, and our view was that we wanted to have a modern, believable young person in that part. So obviously she's going to be a lot feistier and fighting with her mother rather than being very sweet. That wasn't going to work. We needed somebody who was very sure of her own opinions.
From a text terms then.
Okay, so he's the chief culprit anyhow.
So he's the chief culprit anyhow?
Certainly. And he ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, stop! Stop!
Be quiet, Sheila.
But don't you see?
You're behaving like an hysterical child tonight.
Now, are you going to do stop to the inspector?
Maybe it would work better if I did do it to Mother.
You're realizing where this discussion is leading in a way that she isn't realizing it.
Stop
yes.
digging herself into her grave.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe if I do a turn away, because then they can sort of have their little family moment without.
That would help if rather instead of moving in more and more on there.
Yeah.
So he's the chief culprit anyhow again then.
So he's the chief culprit anyhow.
Certainly. And he ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, stop! Stop!
Be quiet, Sheila.
Don't you see?
You're behaving like an hysterical child tonight.
Well, the problem with Mrs. Burling is that she doesn't think that there's any problem in her family at all. All the problems exist outside. So she's quite prepared to put the blame for what's happened to Eva Smith firmly onto the man involved, the father of the child. because she lacks the piece of information that the father of the child is her own son.
You need to find places within the text where you can, with justification, just show a little crack into what becomes a growing uncertainty and where, at the end, her composure is totally destroyed.
He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him.
And if her story is true, that he was stealing money?
There's no point in assuming that.
But suppose we do, what then?
Then he'd be entirely responsible, because the girl wouldn't have come to us and have been refused assistance. If it hadn't been for him...
So he's the chief culprit anyhow?
Certainly.
In a way, you do have to play the bigotry. You do have to play somebody who is always convinced that she's totally right. There can't be any other way of viewing the world, and our class behave like this, that class behave like that, that is how it is. But you also need to show, this is a human being, and you need to show that underneath there is the dawning of a question mark, where there probably never has been before in her life.
Now, Mother, don't you see?
But you... I mean... It's ridiculous.
When you, as an actor, are deciding physically how you show your character, you can't do that in a bubble. You have to do that in relation to the other people on stage, because it must be that your body as a tool of expression is responding to whatever pressure they might be putting on you, what they might be asking of you, needing from you, wanting from you. And you have to show that with your body as well as you are with your text.
Sir, if I prefer not to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind.
Yes, I have.
No, you haven't. Simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it.
I think you did something terribly wrong, and that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish you'd been with me tonight at the interview.
I think it does have a timeless aspect to it, and I think that if actors are playing the truth of the situation, then you can see that timelessness. Then, you know, it will work in Edwardian costumes, it'll work in modern costumes, it'll work if we're all dressed up like Martians.
In this version of An Inspector Calls, we chose to have 2 time zones, Edwardian, which the play was written, and present day, so that it's more contemporary for today's audience, and to be able to move back and forth, hopefully seamlessly between the two, through the eyes of the inspector. And I think this did present particular challenges for the actors.
Mrs. Burling, you're a member, a prominent member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, aren't you?
Well, go on, Mother. You might as well admit it. Yes, she is. Why?
It's an organisation to which women in distress can appeal for help in various forms, isn't that so?
Yes, we've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases.
There was a meeting of the interviewing committee 2 weeks ago.
I dare say there was.
You know very well there was, Mrs. Burling. You were in the chair.
And if I was, what business is it of yours?
Do you want me to tell you in plain words?
That must have been Eric.
Have you been up to his room?
Yes, and I called out on both landings. It must have been Eric we heard go out just then.
Silly boy. Where can he have gone to?
I can't imagine, but he was in one of his excitable, queer moods. Still, we don't need him here.
We do need him here. And if he isn't back soon, I shall have to go and find him.
He's probably just gone to cool off. He'll be back soon.
I hope so.
And why should you hope so?
I'll explain why when you've answered my questions, Mrs. Burling.
Is there any reason my wife should answer questions from you, Inspector?
Yes, a very good reason. You'll remember that Mr. Croft told us, quite truthfully, I believe, that he hadn't spoken to or seen Eva Smith since last September. Mrs. Burling spoke to and saw her only 2 weeks ago.
Is this true?
Yes, quite true.
She appealed to your organisation for help?
Yes.
Not as Eva Smith.
No, nor as Daisy Renton.
As what, then?
First, she called herself Mrs. Burling.
Mrs. Burling?
Yes, I think it was simply a piece of gross impertinence, quite deliberate, and naturally that's one of the things that prejudiced me against her case.
You admit being prejudiced against her case?
Yes.
Mother, she's just died a horrific death, don't forget.
I'm very sorry, but I think she had only herself to blame.
Was it owing to your influence as the most prominent member of the committee that help was refused the girl?
Possibly.
Was it or was it not your influence?
If you think you can bring any pressure to bear upon me, Inspector, you're quite mistaken. Unlike the other three, I've done nothing that I'm ashamed of or that won't bear investigation. The girl asked for assistance. We were asked to look carefully into the claims made upon us. I wasn't satisfied with the girl's claim. She seemed to me to be not a good case. And so I used my influence to have it refused. And in spite of what's happened to the girl since, I consider it my duty. So if I prefer not to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind.
Yes, I have.
No, you haven't. Simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it.
I think you did something terribly wrong, and that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish you'd been with me tonight in the infirmary. You'd have seen...
No, no, please, not that again. I've imagined it enough already.
Then the next time you imagine it, just remember that this girl was going to have a child.
How horrible. Horrible. But how could she have wanted to kill herself?
Because she'd been turned out and turned down too many times. This was the end.
Mother, you must have known.
It was because she was going to have a child that she went for assistance to your mother's committee.
Look here, this wasn't Gerald Croft.
No, nothing to do with him.
Thank goodness for that. Although, I don't know why I should care now.
And you've nothing further to tell me, eh?
I'll tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility.
That doesn't make it any the less yours. She came to you for help at a time when no woman could have needed it more. And you not only refused it yourself, but saw to it that the others refused it too. She was here alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. You've had children, you must have known what she was feeling, and you slammed the door in her face.
Mother, I think it was cruel and vile.
I must say, Sybil, that when this comes out at the inquest, it isn't going to do us much good. The press might easily take it up.
Oh, stop it, both of you. And please remember, before you start accusing me of anything again, that it wasn't I who had her turned out of her employment, which probably began it all. In the circumstances, I think I was justified. The girl had begun by telling us a pack of lies. Afterwards, when I got at the truth, I discovered that she knew who the father was. She was quite certain about that, and so I told her it was her business to make him responsible. If he refused to marry her, and in my opinion he ought to be compelled to, then he must at least support her.
What did she reply to that?
Oh, a lot of nonsense.
What was it?
Whatever it was, I know it finally made me lose all patience with her. She was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position.
Her position now is that she lies with a burnt-out inside on a slab.
No, look.
Don't stammer and yammer at me again, man. I'm losing all patience with you people. What did she say?
She said that the father was only a youngster, silly and wild, drinking too much. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. He had given her money, but she didn't want to take any more money from him.
Why didn't she want to take any more money from him?
Oh, all a lot of nonsense. I didn't believe a word of it.
I'm not asking you if you believed it. I want to know what she said. Why didn't she want to take any more money from this boy?
Oh, she had some fancy reason. As if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money.
I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself. What reason did she give for not taking any more money?
Her story was that he'd said something one night when he was drunk that gave her the idea that it wasn't his money.
Where had he got it from then?
He'd stolen it.
So she'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want to take stolen money.
That's the story she finally told. After I'd refused to believe her original story, that she was a married woman who'd been deserted by her husband, I didn't see any reason to believe that one story should be any truer than the other. Therefore, you're quite wrong to suggest I shall regret what I did.
But if her story was true, if this boy had been giving her stolen money, then she came to you for help because she wanted to keep this youngster out of any more trouble, isn't that so?
Possibly. But it sounded ridiculous to me. So I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance.
And you're not even sorry now, when you know what happened to the girl?
I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it at all. I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it at all.
Who is to blame, then?
That's the girl herself.
For letting Father and me have her chucked out of her jobs.
Secondly, I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If, as she said, he was not of her class, was some drunken young idler, then that's all the more reason he shouldn't be allowed to escape. He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him.
And if her story is true, that he was stealing money?
There's no point in assuming that.
But suppose we do, what then?
Then he'd be entirely responsible because the girl wouldn't have come to us and been refused assistance if it hadn't been for him.
So he's the chief culprit, anyhow?
Certainly. And he ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, stop. Stop.
Be quiet, Sheila.
But don't you see?
You're behaving like an hysterical child tonight. And if you take steps to find this young man, and then make sure he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility, instead of staying here asking quite unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty.
Don't worry, Mrs. Burling. I shall do my duty.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
No hushing up, eh? Make an example of the young man, eh? Public confession of responsibility, hmm?
Certainly. I consider it your duty. And now, no doubt, you'd like to say good night.
Not yet. I'm waiting.
Waiting? For what?
To do my duty.
Now, Mother, don't you see?
Surely, I mean, it's ridiculous.
Look, Inspector, you're not trying to tell us that my son is mixed up in this.
Well, if he is, we know what to do now, don't we? Mrs. Burling has just told us.
My God. But look here.
I don't believe it. I won't believe it. Mother, I begged and I begged you to stop.
This afternoon, a young woman drank some disinfectant and died. A nice little promising life there, I thought. And a nasty mess somebody's made of it. Who is to blame then?
The most important thing when you're directing a play is to go to the centre of the play, the heart of the play.
The director's job is to communicate the idea of the writer, but every director will do that in a slightly different way.
The famous younger generation. They know it all. They can't even take a joke.
Yes.
Mr. Burling speaking.
Yes, Mr. Burling speaking.
Mr. Burling speaking.
My job with Inspector Calls is to try to understand exactly what Priestley was intending and hopefully to reveal his intentions as clearly as possible.
What makes the job fun is that it's up to you to try and find the most effective way of communicating those ideas, and what you have to rely on is your own instincts when you read the play, what you find fascinating, get that over to the audience.
I don't think I've imposed an interpretation on the play. What I've tried to do is reveal J.B. Priestley's original intention. I think it's very hard now to understand the huge change that happened in 1945 in this country. The whole world was entirely different. The country needed to go somewhere else to build a new, better place, an idealism, if you like. And J.B. Priestley was centre to that call to arms, that let's change the world. Proper idealism that resulted in one of the most extraordinary governments of the 20th century, which was the 1945 Labour government. J.B. Priestley, in a sense, wrote this play for that moment. I wanted the actor to have something very specific to play. So rather than him just being some sort of spirit, is actually say, no, this is a demob soldier in 1945, coming back from abroad, coming back to an England that has changed, or has the possibility of changing, and wanting to make a difference.
The inspector is obviously the central character of the play, so that the way you see the inspector, the way the actor plays that part, changes the whole piece. I mean, when Alistair Sim is playing the inspector, he's a very strange, otherworldly, ethereal kind of character who plays it all with a smile on his face. He's never very serious at all, and it's hard to believe he's a real policeman.
Mr. Burling.
Yes?
My name's Pooh. Inspector Pooh.
What's the meaning of this? There's a front door, you know.
I wanted to talk to you, Mr. Burling. I thought I'd find you here.
Very bright of you, I'm sure. People usually are in the dining room at dinner time.
What I really like about Alistair Sim's version of the Inspector Gould is his humanity, is that he comes across as a benign figure, not a revenging angel, but a character who is trying to understand the family, understands that actually they're going to go through something awful, and is in sympathy with the journey that they have to make.
Don't worry, Mrs. Burling, I'll do my duty.
Now, perhaps you'd like to say good night.
Not yet. I'm waiting.
Waiting? For what?
To do my duty.
It can often be played very removed, very cold, unemotional, all-powerful, all-control freak.
But each one of you helped to kill her. Now, just remember that. Don't ever forget it. Then I don't think you ever will. Just remember this. One Eva Smith's gone. But there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their sufferings, their chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We're all members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I'll tell you this, that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they'll be taught it in blood and fire and anguish. Good night.
The main fire, blood and anguish speech goes absolutely to the heart of the issue. In the film version with Alistair Sim, he never does the main speech of the play.
It isn't only Eva Smith, Father. It's all the other Eva Smiths. The things we do to people without realizing it. Only for once we've seen the consequences.
Yes, I was rather hoping one of you would say something like that.
The play is like a puzzle. What's interesting to know with the inspector is not what he knows, but really to try to analyse and find out what he doesn't know.
Why did she ask for help?
You know perfectly well why she asked for help.
No, I don't. I know why she needed help, but as I wasn't there, I don't know what she asked from your committee.
I don't think we need discuss it.
You have no hope of not discussing it, Mrs. Burling.
If you think you can bring any pressure to bear on me, Inspector, you are quite mistaken!
So the inspector himself is trying to piece together the story of Eva Smith's life as he talks to the family.
Priestley's play is so beautifully structured that it leads you on this pathway of discovery right the way through it, and you could view the whole thing up to the point of the phone call as a detective thriller. I mean, a very good detective thriller, but only a detective thriller. It's with the phone call coming at the end that the whole thing is turned on its head, and you know that the inspector was not just an inspector of police. He was inspecting the Burlings and all of us.
Whoever that inspector was, it was anything but a joke. They knew a thing. They began to learn something. So, ready to go on in the same old way.
What actually happens in the play, obviously, is that time stops for the time at which the inspector, and it's interesting to try to define exactly when, for the family, time stops. The inspector, in a sense, comes in terms of his time little window, gives them the opportunity of seeing the future. He leaves, time starts again, and then the real inspector phones. So they have this opportunity of the future.
I remember what he said, and how he looked, and what he made me feel. Fire, and blood, and anguish.
Priestley had some very interesting ideas about time. Rather like in the film Back to the Future, you can move from the past to the present to the future, just going back and forth. Within a single instant, you just step from one to the other. And he does that in An Inspector Calls, but you don't realize it until the very end.
That was the police. A girl has just died on her way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant. A police inspector is on his way here to ask some questions.
Priestley chose to set An Inspector Calls in the Edwardian period. He mentions the date of 1910 and 1912 and the sinking of the Titanic and various other facts that happened at that time. And I didn't want to change that because I felt Priestley put it there for a purpose and we should have it there. But at the same time, the message is so universal that I wanted the audience to feel this is for us now. And out of that came the feeling that we should have both Edwardian and present day side by side, that we could slip from one thing to the other.
Each of you helped to kill her. Remember that. Never forget it. But then I don't think you ever will.
Eva Smith's gone. You can't do her any more harm. You can't do her any good now, either. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith.
That's the worst of it.
But just remember this. One Eva Smith has gone. But there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives, with what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you, that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night.
You're the one I blame for this.
I'll bet I am.
Yes, and you don't realise yet all you've done. Most of this is bound to come out. There will be a public scandal.
I don't care now.
You don't seem to care about anything. But I care. I was almost certain for a knighthood in the next honours list.
Oh, for God's sake. What does it matter now, whether they give you a knighthood or not?
It doesn't matter to you. Apparently, nothing matters to you. But let me tell you that until every penny of that money you stole is repaid, you will work for nothing. And there will be no more of this drinking around town and picking up women in the palace bar.
I should think not. I'm absolutely ashamed of you, Eric.
Well, I don't blame you. But don't forget, I'm ashamed of you as well. Both of you.
Drop that. There is every excuse for what both your mother and I did. Turned out unfortunately, that's all.
That's all?
Well, what have you to say?
I don't know where to begin.
Then don't begin. Nobody wants you to.
I behaved badly too. I know I did, and I'm ashamed of it. But now you're beginning all over again to pretend that nothing much has happened.
Nothing much has happened. Haven't I already said there will be a public scandal unless we're lucky? And who here will suffer from that more than I will?
It's not what I'm talking about. I don't care about that. The point is, you don't seem to have learnt anything.
Don't I? Well, you're quite wrong there. I have learnt plenty tonight. And you don't want me to tell you what I've learned, I hope. When I look back on tonight, when I think of what I was feeling when the five of us sat down to dinner at that table.
Yes. And do you remember what you said to Gerald and me after dinner, when you were feeling so pleased with yourself? You told us that a man has to make his own way, look after himself, and mind his own business. And that we weren't to take any notice of these cranks who tell us that everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we're all mixed up together. Do you remember? Yes. And then one of those cranks walked in, the inspector. Oh, I didn't notice you told him that it's every man for himself.
Is that when the inspector came, just after Father had said that?
Yes, what of it?
What's the matter now, Sheila?
Well, it's queer, very queer.
I know what you're going to say, because I've been wondering myself.
Well, it doesn't much matter now, of course, but was he really a police inspector? It's Mr. Croft.
I hope you don't mind my coming back.
No, of course not.
I had a special reason for coming. When did that inspector go?
Only a few minutes ago. He put us all through it.
Sheila.
Gerald might as well know.
No, we needn't bother him with all that stuff.
All right. Well, we're all in it, up to the neck. It got worse after you left.
How did he behave?
Oh, he was frightening.
If you ask me, he behaved in a very peculiar and suspicious manner.
The rude way he spoke to Mr. Burley was absolutely extraordinary.
You know something. What is it?
That man wasn't a police officer.
What?
Are you certain?
I'm almost certain. That's what I came back to tell you.
Good lad, you asked about it, eh?
Yes, I met this police sergeant I know down the road. I asked him about this Inspector Gould, described the chap very carefully to him. And I asked him about this Inspector Gould, described the chap very carefully to him. And he swore there wasn't any Inspector Gould or anybody like him on the force here. Or anyone like him on the force here.
No suicide?
Well, we can settle that at once.
Well, how?
By ringing up the infirmary. Either there's a dead girl there or there isn't.
Yeah, it'll look a bit queer, won't it, ringing up at this time of night?
I don't mind doing it.
And if there isn't?
Brumley, 8986. Anyway, we'll see. Is that the infirmary? This is Mr. Gerald Croft of Crofts Limited. Yes. We're rather worried about an employee of ours. Have you had a girl brought in this afternoon who committed suicide after drinking disinfectant or any like suicide? You're certain of that? I see. Well, thank you very much. Good night. No girl has died in there today. Nobody's been brought in after drinking disinfectant. They haven't had a suicide for months.
You are proof positive. Oh, the whole story is just a lot of moonshine. It's nothing but an elaborate shell. Hey, Gerald, have a drink.
Oh, thanks. I think I could do with one just now.
So could I.
And I must say, you've argued this very cleverly, Gerald, and I'm most grateful.
Well, you see, while I was out of the house, I had time to cool off and think things out a little.
Yes, he didn't keep you on the run like the rest of us. I'll admit I was a little scared at the time, but then I'd a special reason for not wanting any public scandal just now. Well, here's to us. Oh, come on, Sheila, don't look like that. It's all over now.
The worst part of it is, but you're forgetting one thing I still can't forget. That everything we said had happened really had happened. And if it didn't end tragically, well, then that's lucky for us. But it might have done.
But it's all different now. Come, you can see that, can't you? You all helped to kill her. I wish you could have seen the look on your faces when he said that. Going to bed, young woman?
I want to get out of this. It frightens me the way you talk.
Nonsense. You'll have a good laugh over this yet. You want to ask Gerald for that ring you gave back to him, eh? Then you'll feel better.
You're pretending everything's just as it was before.
I'm not.
No. But these others are.
Well, isn't it? We've been had, that's all.
So nothing really happened. So there's nothing to be sorry for. Nothing to learn. We can all go on behaving just as we did.
Well, why shouldn't we?
I tell you, whoever that inspector was, it was anything but a joke. You knew it then. You began to learn something. And now you've stopped. You're ready to go on in the same old way.
And you're not, eh? And you're not, eh?
No. Because I remember what he said, how he looked, what he made me feel. Fire and blood and anguish. And it frightens me the way you talk. And I can't listen to any more of it.
And I agree with Sheila. It frightens me too.
Well, go to bed then. Don't stand there being hysterical.
They're overtired. In the morning, they'll be as amused as we are.
Everything's all right now, Sheila. Look, what about this ring?
No, not yet. It's too soon. I must think.
Oh, now look at the pair of them, the famous younger generation who know it all, and they can't even take a joke. Yes? Ah, Mr. Bowling speaking. What? Here? That was the police. Our girl has just died on her way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant. And a police inspector is on his way here to ask some questions.